Okay, good morning to everybody. I think it's 9 o'clock, so I'll go ahead and get started. Looks like we have a few people on the live Zoom link, so welcome, good morning to you. And what we're going to do today is we're going to pick up a bit from where we ended last week in the end of 9, and we'll pretty well be on track with where we ought to be. I had assigned initially chapter 14 for this upcoming exam, but it doesn't look like we're going to get there, and it's not that critical that we do anyway. What I'd rather do is spend a little bit more time in focusing on chapters 12 and 13 this week. And I just put both of those packages together in the PowerPoint as one, because they really are, they go together, even though the ideas presented in chapter 12, sort of the theoretical ideas, and those presented in chapter 13 are quite different from each other, but yet they do form the body of what is really considered macro thinking at the moment. So today we're going to talk about, we're going to pick up from our discussion about John Maynard Keynes and his work beginning in the 1930s, and we'll finish that today. And on Thursday, we'll pick up and talk about the classical, or neoclassical school. And if there's any fragment of this left over from Thursday, then we'll pick it up again next week and finish that before we review for the third exam. So our third exam in class is coming up next week. It'll be available on Thursday after class, and it'll be available in Brightspace for you to take. Or you can take it in class on Thursday, or you can simply take it in one of the testing centers, whichever you prefer. I do ask that if you're going to come to one of the campuses, either in class or in the testing center, just let me know so that I have a paper copy available for you, because obviously I won't have one if it's done in Brightspace, which is what it's going to be. And everybody the last 2 times has done it that way, so I presume that's the way you want to do it, but it's entirely up to you because we all are different. So your preferences are accounted for in this particular course setup. Okay, so that's where we are, and I did email out the PowerPoint package last night, so everybody should have that now, and you can sort of follow along with me. Some of the material I'm going to be talking about, particularly in chapter 12, is going to be really covered more in Appendix B, which I didn't assign as readings, and I probably should have, to be honest with you, because it dovetails very nicely with what we're doing in chapter 12, but I'm not going to go after the fact and assign it, and there won't be any questions on the exam from that particular appendix, so you don't have to worry about that. But you do want to pay attention to what I'm going to go over here, because it's going to sort of form the basis for macro modeling that is really the foundation of what Keynesian economics is all about. Keynes was really considered to be the first macroeconomist. In fact, as I've mentioned before to the class, that the term macro really didn't even exist until sometime after the Great Depression got going. The idea being that the entire macroeconomy was just simply a collection of individual markets, and that, you know, the sum was, or that the macroeconomy was the sum of its parts. And I think that is not the case today. Most of us would agree that macroeconomy is something different and unique. And in fact, there are topics and variables that we talk about in macro that we really don't in micro. Even though some of those topics are more familiar to the average person, which is one reason why I think a lot of people think macro is a little bit more, a little less abstract, more apprehensible, because it deals with things like unemployment, inflation, recession, those sorts of things, terms that we're all familiar with. Okay, so let's pick up from here. Last time we talked about the work of John Maynard Keynes. We didn't get very far into it at all, and we'll come back and talk a bit toward the end of this discussion about what some of the main ideas are, particularly with regard to the configuration of aggregate supply and what that really means to an economy, and then why, when we contrast that with the classical view of the macroeconomy, at least from the supply side, we'll see that it's quite different, and what are the implications of that for policy, and what are the expectations for policy given these pretty different worldviews. And you'll see this forms the basis for some of the disputes and debates over macro policy that exist even to this very day. And it would be nice for me to tell you that, like chemistry and physics, that all these questions are answered. These are the settled laws of economics, and that we can all now agree on. But there is disagreement, and much of it has to do with what the role of government is, and even more importantly than that, how effective government actually is. And so that's a pretty, those are pretty important issues to talk about. Okay, so when we talk about Keynesian economics, let's talk about this. First of all, what was Keynes interested in doing in the 1930s when he published what was his big work called the General Theory? Well, he's trying to find an explanation for why an economy could get stuck in low gear. Now, we talked about this idea that there was sort of a metaphor between the market for labor and a broader economy, or even any individual market. That is, wages are sticky and so are prices. And this idea of stickiness really refers to this idea that they don't move, they're not flexible, not well lubricated, they don't, flow upward and outward and all this good stuff. Instead, they get jammed in place, oftentimes stuck at a level where workers don't want to take wage decreases, which is not a huge surprise to anybody, and firms don't want to take price cuts on the goods that they're selling. And so as a result, firms would rather take fewer sales and workers would rather have fewer workers, meaning in particular, this whole idea of insider outsiders, and those who've got more seniority, oftentimes are the ones who are spared the axe when job cuts come along. And they're perfectly fine with that as long as they're not the ones getting the axe. And there's a lot of evidence to support that view. And I know that unionization was one of these efforts to try to overcome this natural inclination of human nature to say, let the other person go. Don't fire me. I've been here 12 years. This person's been here 3 months. Why should I take a pay cut to accommodate this person? Or why should I lose my job? In particular, why should I take a pay cut? Why does this person lose his or her job? And those of us who are experienced know how to do the work better anyway. We'll work harder and we'll get through this together. But this is what we'd rather see happen. So those wages become stuck at that particular level. In other words, they can't adjust downward. Meaning, because they can't adjust downward, firms don't hire more workers in sluggish economic times, and that contributes to unemployment and lower spending overall. So you kind of get the idea as to what's happening there. So this idea of stickiness sort of is something that kind of is found throughout Keynes's work, and it's a little bit hard to explain other than to sort of show examples. And so let's start with a pretty basic example, going back to our original model of gross domestic product from the income side, okay? Because we're talking here about incomes, which then translate to spending. And one of the things that we will say about Keynesian economics and the neo-Keynesians who followed is that it is almost exclusively a demand side theory. And then the classicists that we'll talk about beginning on Thursday are almost exclusively a supply side theory. So given the fact that there's emphasis on different parts of the economy, aggregate demand in this case, aggregate supply in this case, you get the idea that you've got a fundamental split between which is the most important side to sort of protect or to stimulate in order to get the economy moving. So going back to this national income model, well, we started with GDP, and which is the same as Y, and we sort of took some things out. We got down to net domestic product, and we got down to national income, and these little dots. I'm just sort of cutting out some steps here just to move ourselves along. And we eventually arrive at personal income. And we define personal income as household income pre-tax. Okay? Household income before tax. And the tax here I'm talking about is not sales tax or property tax, but income tax. Income tax. So personal income is income before personal income tax. And generally, when we're doing modeling of this kind, we usually the income tax we're referring to as federal tax, mostly because it's easier to work with that because all Americans pay income tax, even if they don't live in America, whereas not all Americans pay a federal income tax. Not all Americans pay a state income tax because some states don't have an income tax. So if you take out taxes here, personal income taxes, then we arrive, this should be a review, at disposable income. Disposable income. And this is equivalent to, I'm running out of ink here, aren't I? Household income after tax. Okay. So this is after tax income of the household. And so what can households do with disposable income? Now remember, we've taken out all the actors in the economy, and this is the income approach. So this is the all the income which flows to all the actors in the economy, including governments collecting tax all along here through corporate income taxes, through dividends taxes, through sales taxes, property taxes, all kinds of taxes. Corporations are receiving their income through net income. And when I say corporations as a sort of stand-in for firms, I'm saying that firms, that actor group firms in the circular flow model really is dominated by corporations. And then we worked our way down to households. And it's households that really are interesting to Keynes, because households really constitute 2/3 of consumption spending, of spending in the economy, that is consumer spending. It's actually a little bit greater than 2/3 spending. And during the last recession of 2008, 2009, it was a little over that. 2/3 would be like 67%. It was about 72%, mostly because of the fall off in business spending, mostly due to the lack of new construction that was going on, because it was difficult to get financing. Banks weren't lending, people weren't building or buying. So the share of spending in the economy was really being absorbed mostly by households, about 72%. So it's an important part of the economy, even though, and I think I've said this before, that I think there's a tendency for us to have the idea that the economy is dominated by the big players, the big corporations and whatnot. And I understand where that comes from, particularly given the tremendous influence that some of these big corporations have. But collectively, households spend more and earn more than any other actor group in the economy. Okay, so it's important to note the role of disposable income, because that is household income after tax. And out of that, there are only two things a household can do with it. That is channel it toward consumption or channel it towards savings. They can either consume it or they can save it. Okay, they can consume it or they can save it. Now we're going to talk a lot more about savings, particularly not next week, I guess, week 12, when we start our discussion about money and banking and the role of financial intermediaries within the economy. But for right now, let's talk a little bit about savings and what savings is. And I think this is a bit of a review. I think I've talked about this a bit before, but there are only two things that a household can do with disposable income. They can spend it, i.e. translate that into consumption, or they can save it. And I know that oftentimes there's a third option that sometimes people will consider, and that's charitable giving, like if I give money to a church or charity or whatever. Well, that's really an act of consumption, because it usually all that recipient is sort of an intermediary that will eventually channel it into spending, really usually fairly quickly, and it doesn't meet the criteria here of savings, which is deferred consumption. So savings is considered to be deferred consumption. The idea being at some point savings will get spent. But where does that savings go in the meantime? We say that it is deposited somewhere with financial intermediaries. And the one intermediary that comes to mind is banks, obviously. Financial intermediaries. So banks are obviously an important recipient of that, but it's not just banks, and it isn't just bank deposits. So when we think of savings, we should not think of savings accounts per se. Right? Where you put money in, you can go get it. Put money in on Wednesday, go get it back on Monday, or whatever. That's not really what we're talking about. It includes that, but it's not only that. In fact, even if you put money in a checking account and leave it there, that would still be considered deposit with a financial intermediary and not spent. Not channeled into consumption. And the idea being that at some point these savings will get turned into spending at some point. The evidence for that, what people point to as evidence for that, is the fact that if you were to never spend savings ever, and you just saved, let's say you saved even a modest portion of your income, 5% of your income, from the day you first start receiving income, maybe selling snow cones at Isotopes Park or whatever. You save, and built up. The amount of earnings, even on a very modest rate of return, and the snowball effect would be gigantic. I know that when IRA accounts were first developed back in the late 1970s, early 80s, people were talking about the fact that if you put the maximum in per year, which at the time was $2,000, which was a pretty good chunk of pay for a lot of people, 40 years ago, whatever. But if you did put it in, that if you were just starting out, just having graduated college at, at what was the traditional college graduation age, and by the time you got to be 65, at even a normal rate of return, you'd have over $1 billion. And so think about it, that's still, those math principles still apply today. And even if, and now you can put even more into those, and there's no tax coming out. You pay tax when you withdraw. I'm talking about a traditional IRA, not a Roth IRA, which I don't want to make this overly complicated, but you get the idea, this whole idea of growing. And so why do we say that we assume that savings are going to get spent? It's because there aren't these gigantic fortunes that have been passed on from family to family to family. There are, but they're not. But if you took family wealth over 200 years, not just the 40 years from working age to retirement, you'd have these massive amounts of money. And in fact, I know we had a textbook once that talked about compound interest. And Keynes called it compound interest magic, just the mathematics of it. And that there's an example given where the Native American group that sold Manhattan Island, I think it was the Dutch, in the 1600s, received something equivalent to $24 in goods or whatnot. Of course, that's always been the sort of joke about that, is that it's such a low price given the expensive value. But of course, Manhattan wasn't worth very much anyway. It was swampy, rocky in those days, and so the group might have thought that was a pretty good deal on their part. But the point is that if you're taking it and investing in something like a 5% return, that by today would be worth several hundred $million. That's the power of compound interest. And we just don't see that so much happening, those gigantic fortunes. And so this idea of savings is something that accumulates. And I only bring up that example just to show you how, if you were to magnify something over many years, you have a gigantic amount of savings. And so as a result, savings, which is deposited somewhere in with financial intermediaries, can be deposited not just in banks, but in investment firms, insurance companies like annuities, even the bond market, which we'll talk a bit about in chapter 14, and other places like that. So when we talk about this, we're saying there are choices that households have to make. And what are the implications then for households? And I'm going to build a really small model here dealing with these particular relationships. And so what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to put disposable income on this axis here. Usually we put dollar figures on this axis, but we're going to put dollar figures on both axes. We're going to put disposable income there, and we're going to put consumption here. And we're going to simply do this. We're going to draw a line which bisects this right angle here, and it's called the 45-degree line. So it exactly bisects it. And what does that mean if you've got a 45-degree line? It basically means any value that falls on this. If you have equivalent values on here, and we do, because we're not talking apples and oranges, we're talking apples and apples, dollars and dollars. So if you have the exact same value, or any value that falls on that dotted line,
do your fucking homework.
Well, value in both cases.
And do me one more favor.
If you have $50,000 and consumption is $50,000.
Just give me that blanket.
All of your consumption, all of your disposable income is channeled to consumption. So let's draw what a line looks like, a consumption line. It's basically an expenditure line, where it looks something like this. And we can simply say that consumption looks like that. Now, in reality, it might be a little more curvy than the linear function that I've drawn here, the straight line. But for right now, purposes of drawing a straight line, are going to simplify the analysis. Okay, so we get a straight line that's considered the consumption line. So where this thing crosses the dotted line here, we can say that consumption equals disposable income. Consumption equals disposable income, and so for whatever that particular value is, consumption equals disposable income. In other words, there is, how can consumption ever equal disposable income? It must only be when there is zero savings. So there is zero savings at this point. In other words, every dollar that is earned by not just a household, but all households in the U.S. economy are channeled into consumption. Okay. So there's a metaphor for this for the broader economy that I will get to, and which is what we talk about when we call the expenditures model, which leads us to build a model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. That's really what is talked mostly about in chapter 12. Some of this goes back to the appendix, which I guess in future classes I probably will assign as reading. I just didn't want to do it here because I had neglected to, but it's a pretty revealing bit of information here. So what about this? You've got zero income. Nonetheless, got some kind of spending going on here. Well, what on earth is that? Why would you have some kind of spending at zero income? And we simply refer to this as autonomous consumption. Autonomous consumption. And that is consumption even when there is no income. And how can that happen? Why at zero income is there autonomous consumption? Well, it basically has to do with the idea of how would anybody spend money that they don't have? Well, they would borrow it or they would receive transfers, wouldn't they? Or they would withdraw from savings. Okay? So, in other words, but isn't this the case? It's not just here at zero, it's also here. It's here, it's here, it's here. This entire shaded region here is a case in which consumption is greater than disposable income, right? And certainly consumption is greater than disposable income here because it's zero, but it's also greater here, it's greater here, it's greater here, it's greater here. And this entire region here is what is known as dis savings. Dis savings. And I know that it sounds like I just made that term up, but it's the opposite of savings. And think about this, this is not really that unusual of an idea if you consider why dis savings happens. How can somebody spend more than what they are earning? Or the entire economy is funded through with savings, right, or by borrowing, which basically is the same transaction macroeconomically. Savings or by borrowing is the same transaction macroeconomically because why? Because every time you borrow money, you're actually borrowing from someone's savings. And now, clearly, it's the case if you borrow from somebody you know, a friend or family member. Hey, can I borrow $100? I'll pay you back on Friday or whatever. They would be withdrawing money from their savings. That is their money that they're not consuming at the moment. They're saving, and maybe it's deposited with financial intermediaries. Maybe it's not, but it's nonetheless the same action. You're borrowing from someone's savings. If you borrow from a bank, you're still borrowing from someone's savings because the fundings of those borrowings all come from people's savings. And that's when I say people, it's individuals, households, governments, and business firms. Okay, so it's the same transaction macroeconomically, except that you've got an intermediary involved, typically in the case of borrowing. Okay, but so funded with savings or borrowing, or one other thing, by transfers. And when we talk about transfers, we talked a bit about this, and maybe not enough actually. When we first talked about the income approach back in chapter 6, and what was that about? When we talked about transfers, all transfers are simply one-way movements of money from government to households usually, although there are some governmental transfers to businesses. And we saw something like this happen with the CARES Act and other related acts. There were actually quite a lot of pieces of law that were passed during the beginning of the pandemic that aided both mostly households, but also businesses, where there were transfers to businesses, particularly to landlords in some cases, to restaurants as one particular industry that was hit hard. But primarily, since we're talking about a model of consumption in households, we'll focus on household transfers. And what are we talking about when we talk about transfers? Transfers are those one-way movements of money from government to households that don't require a quid pro quo. You just have to be eligible. You don't have to do anything, you just have to be eligible. And when I say you don't have to do anything, I mean you don't have to earn it. You just have to be eligible for it. And I know when I say that, one of the biggest transfer of all is Social Security retirement benefits. I know Social Security is a bigger program than simply retirement. There's also a disability benefit available to those who qualify. There's also a death benefit for minor dependents. So I know that there's hospitalization. There are all kinds of other arms and legs to it, but primarily the major one is retirement income to people who are over a certain age, usually 62. 65 is right now the retirement age. to get what are called full benefits, but even that's misleading because you can wait until 70 to get a bigger benefit. To me, that sounds more full than a smaller benefit, but it doesn't really mean as much as what it does. Usually 62 is about the beginning for somebody who is, particularly somebody who's still married. Okay, so it's a big one. Yeah, now when I say you don't have to do anything, those are probably fighting words to a lot of seniors who would say, what do you mean I didn't have to do anything? Oh, yeah, I worked 50 years and paid into it. That's true. So what I'm simply saying is that to get the benefit, you just have to be eligible, because in reality, the sad case is if you are, particularly if you're single and have no dependents, and you've paid Social Security your entire working life, that is Social Security tax, and you pass away before you get to retirement age, that money is gone. It's gone with the wind. It's not inherited by anybody. Because you're not married, you have no children, and so, or no dependents, I should say, and so it's gone. So it's a tax. So Social Security is funded by tax, and it's paid out as a benefit that you just have to be eligible to get in order to receive benefits. So that's a big one, but it's not the only one. Medicaid is a big one. That's healthcare assistance. Healthcare. It's basically a national healthcare program for those who qualify, usually based upon income and family size, etc. Medicare is for older people who it's a very similar program, but it's age dependent. And there are other kinds of programs as well. So that's how this savings is funded, where somebody can maintain a consumption in excess of what they earn through disposable income. That is from activities like work and wages and rents and interest and all that. Okay, so there's that region there. What about this region where consumption is less than disposable income? So if this is consumption is greater than disposable income, consumption here is less than disposable income. Here, all these regions here. So as a result, this is a region that we refer to as savings. And notice that where does most of the savings reside? At the higher income spectrum of disposable income, which is what we would expect to happen. Most of the savings resides with those with higher disposable income. This should not come as a shock to anybody, because obviously at lower disposable incomes, one has less ability to save. There are a lot of people who would say, I would love to save if I could, right? And it becomes very difficult. And there is a particular catch-22 when it comes to savings, particularly for people who are just sort of starting out. And that is, with people who are just starting out, their incomes are lower, simply because they just haven't acquired the skills and experience and seniority within whatever occupation they're doing. So their incomes are not as high as they're going to be, but they're also at the age where they're having children. And most of us want to have children. So it's kind of a double whammy, where it's hard to save with children, and it's also harder to save with a lower income. And so what usually tends to happen is that people's kids grow up and move away at the time that their incomes are now bursting higher because of higher seniority, higher experience, greater levels of authority and whatnot. So this is when people's incomes sort of zoom up. So there is an age-dependent aspect of this. This is certainly not indicative of everybody who's younger. There are people who are very highly skilled, who are paid lots of money early on, and there are people who are toward the end of their careers who are not particularly well paid. So I get that. There are examples of this, but I'm saying this is sort of the trend. And by the way, when we talk a bit on Thursday about classical theory, we'll talk about the work of Milton Friedman, who had a lot to say about this idea of what's called life cycle earnings. That is, he believed that people spend money throughout their lives based upon what they expect to earn throughout their lifetimes. And that is, they'll go into debt when they're younger, feeling that they can pay it off as they begin to earn more. And that's part of the logic of borrowing for student loans. You're borrowing quite a lot of money in some cases, with the expectation you'll pay it off as you get further into life, and you'll begin to pay those off. So you get the idea. Now, what does this all mean to the macroeconomy? Well, it means something because of the fact that we're going to talk about this idea of savings and dissavings and what that might mean. And that is this, that savings is not all that it's cracked up to be. We think savings is a good thing, that it represents responsibility and one's taking care of one's finances and planning for the future, and all that's true. Macroeconomically, however, savings though slows the economy down. It slows the economy down. So when we talk about savings, savings is what we call a leakage for the income stream, because it takes away income that would be channeled back toward additional income. Whereas savings or borrowing is what's called an injection. So again, we use more automotive metaphors. Savings is a leakage because it takes money out of the system and does not rechannel itself back into new spending. But yet borrowing does do that. Now, you might say, okay, but if savings becomes borrowing, then doesn't that ultimately that leakage, which is maybe very short term, a few days maybe, become an injection? Maybe yes, maybe no, because keep in mind that if it's primarily deposited with financial intermediaries, there is no force on earth that's going to really cause banks to lend money, or mortgage companies to lend money, or finance companies, or anybody to advance money for anything. And even during the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, I remember the Treasury Secretary at the time being asked about whether or not banks could be coaxed into lending money, because they were really pulling their reins in, and they weren't lending money very much. And he said, well, we can't make banks lend money. And that was a pretty good indication of the fact that the government is generally unwilling to force banks to lend. In fact, in some cases, they have discouraged banks from lending in some cases. And I don't know that we'll get to that particular situation with the current inflationary environment, but there was a case in the late 70s, early 80s, when the government really discouraged banks from lending in order to slow the economy down. And as a result, to have less injection, boom, and less savings in that direction. Okay, so let's do this. Let's take this general model and let's build a model of the macroeconomy, which is what's called the expenditures model, which is really the heart of Keynesian economics and is really sort of the main event of what I'm trying to get at today. And that is basically this. It's going to be the same methodology here, except that we are going to now talk about GDP here. So rather than disposable income, which is that which accrues to households, we'll be talking about all spending throughout the economy. And let me make this a little bigger graph here. I'm not really happy with that. So there we go. And so we have GDP on this axis. And we're going to simply start with consumption, okay? On that axis there. And we're going to have the same 45-degree line. And we're going to talk about what stimulates GDP. What causes GDP to go up? And remember, what is the fact of GDP? That it's the very definitional aspect of GDP is that output, the production of goods and services, must accrue somewhere as income. If I produce goods, I'm earning an income for it. And income here is not to be construed as income like net profit, like in an accounting context, like business profit after taking out costs and all that. We're simply talking about inflows of resources. Revenues is really what we're talking about here. Revenues are inflows, and any actor, households, firms, or government can earn those inflows. And so what can cause those inflows to happen? Well, we'll talk about it. So let's sort of build a model of the macroeconomy that takes these individual in. So if the only amount of spending we have in the economy is consumption, then we have consumption here, and we have GDP that arrives at some, we'll call it Y1. Okay? It's some sort of Y1. And as a result of this, that is, and it's neither good nor bad, it just sort of is what it is. Well, we know that GDP is more than this. Remember that when we talked about the idea of GDP, for the income approach, we said that Y, particularly at equilibrium, is the point at which aggregate demand equals aggregate supply. When aggregate demand is equal to what? What is aggregate demand equal to? Aggregate demand is equal to consumption plus investment plus government spending plus the difference between exports and imports. Okay? So in other words, Y equals aggregate demand, which is equivalent to all of these. So we haven't built the entire picture yet, have we? So all we've got here so far is consumption. Let's add investment. So let's do that. Let's add investment spending to the equation. And these are maybe not drawn particularly to scale, but we'll kind of get the idea here. So, and as to the slope of these, let's not worry about that right now. So you've got investment here. And what does investment help do? investment boosts overall GDP because it's an element of spending. So as a result, investment goes up. And so the more spending we have by the business sector on goods like inventory, machinery, equipment, real estate, etc., construction is the better. And then, so here's the thing. So let's just say right now that we've got consumption plus investment, and we've got some GDP figure right there. Okay, we'll call it Y2. In other words, we'll say that Y2 is actual GDP. But here's where Keynes is coming from and talking about in the Great Depression, and that is this: that what if full employment GDP is somewhere out here? Okay. In other words, there's a gap, an output gap between this that constitutes this interval here. That is, actual GDP is less than full employment GDP, which I think in your book is called Y sub P, or potential GDP. It's the same thing. Full employment GDP, full potential GDP is the same thing. I think a lot of my slides have it as Y sub FE, full employment. It is the very same thing. It also translates to an unemployment rate, which is only indicative of frictional and structural unemployment. That is, there is no cyclical unemployment, no downturn. Now here we're saying there probably is cyclical unemployment because there's a gap here. So the actual GDP figures here, and there's an output gap, and this is the gap that needs to be filled. And so what can get us then to this particular level of GDP? The answer Keynes has is that of government spending. So C plus I plus G. And what Keynes is saying is that there are some times in which the economy gets stuck at levels below GDP and can't get there. The only way it can get there is by adding G, government spending. And government spending can take the form of building projects. It can take the form of stimulus, right? In other words, this delta G here, delta G, when it's positive, is known as stimulus, right? And I think we have all heard that word quite a lot in the last couple of years, right? And it's been around for a long time. Because whenever there's a downturn in the economy due to something, we're always hearing about people clamoring for some kind of stimulus, and that's no exception with this pandemic-related issue. So government stimulus through whatever. Now, it doesn't really make any difference macroeconomically as to what the spending is on. And I know that, and Keynes even had an example in his book where he talked about this idea that the government could, this is kind of a weird example, but the government could bury a bottle of diamonds, where you get the idea of a bottle of diamonds, in a mountain, and then firms would be rewarded by employing workers to dig up parts of the mountain in order to find it. Whoever got the diamonds would be rewarded. It sounds like a strange program, but everyone would be paid for the effort by government to do that. And I know that's kind of an example. It doesn't really exactly make everybody excited, but he also talked about the idea that you could hire 100 guys in the first shift to dig a hole and 100 guys in the second shift to fill the hole back up. Now, that is sort of given rise to complaints about government spending as being wasteful and not really accomplishing anything. And I think even he was recognizing how ludicrous that particular example is. Instead, one of the things he recommended was public works projects, which was exactly what was adopted during the Great Depression in the 1930s. And as government got involved in lots and lots of building projects and things which put people to work right away. Things like rural electrification. There's a lot of places in the country in the United States didn't have electricity, and so the government made a concerted effort to run electricity lines and to hire people to do that, to build more public highways. The Hoover Dam, spanning Arizona and Nevada was part of that project, and many other projects as well. In other words, a stimulus to the economy to boost GDP, to get GDP to fill this particular gap. And what I haven't covered is the net exports issue. And simply put, if net exports is negative, it's going to bring down GDP because it's going to cross at a lower level. And if it's positive, it's going to be a boost. So it's the very same methodology here. I just haven't included this in our example because it's really not that relevant to the picture. This is a smaller bit of the economy anyway. The key point to talk about is this idea of the gap, the output gap being filled. Okay, the output gap, this is a recessionary gap. That is a gap in which actual output is less than full employment output. So that needs to somehow be filled with some sort of stimulus, some sort of government spending. And then furthermore, savings is sort of a thing which is sort of to be discouraged. Because here's the thing that was really critical. In the Great Depression, which again, depressions are differentiated from recessions because they're longer and they're deeper, and they're usually due to something really structurally wrong in the economy. Something's happened. It's oftentimes a breakdown in the financial part of the economy. We've seen that happen a number of times, certainly in the early 2000s with the financial crisis that we had. But even before that, we had in 1929, it really collapsed the entire banking system. And before that, in 1907, there was a collapse of the banking system. 1893, it collapsed the system. 1850 something. And so we've had these periodic collapses of finance, which have led to full-blown depressions. Fortunately, we haven't had a full-blown depression since the 1930s, mostly because government has figured out how to put a landing pad underneath us so we can sort of bounce back, sort of a trampoline, so that when we fall, we don't hit the ground, we instead can bounce back. And that safety net is considered to be a good thing. Now, I know some are critical of it, particularly when it comes to things like transfers, right? That there are a lot of people who don't like the idea of paying taxes so that others can receive benefits. I get that. There's not much that we can do to assuage those concerns. It is what it is. We're going to pay taxes in order to provide transfers to people. And by the way, in the case of Social Security, which is the biggest, that is retirement benefits, we are paying for ourselves really in some fashion, even though the dollars that we're paying now, those of us who are working, are going to current recipients. And in a few years, I'll be getting Social Security benefits, and everybody who's working will be paying into that for me. And I will thank you in advance for that. But the money that I paid in now for the last several decades has now gone away, but you get the idea. So yes, it's controversial, the idea of government involvement, but I've been saying this the entire semester that almost anything we talk about in macro is going to be controversial, including the idea of government involvement in the economy. And this is really where government first got involved in a major way in trying to manage the economy. Excuse me. Because if you think about the government's response to that financial crisis in the late 20s, it was considered to be very inadequate. And in fact, the president at the time, Herbert Hoover, said, look, the economy is fundamentally sound, right? It sounds very similar to what President Bush said in 2008, the economy is fundamentally sound, almost word for word. And in reality, that's not an untrue, those were not untrue statements in either case. It wasn't the fundamentals, it was something that was broken in the economy, and as a result, it dragged down the rest of the economy with it, which tells us what? That the economy is fragile. And this is really the heart of Keynesian theory, is the idea that these are unstable variables, that the economy is inherently unstable. That's really one of the hallmarks of economic thinking. And by the way, if we could count on private actors, households and businesses to do the spending, to carry the lifting of spending, to move the economy to full employment from wherever it is presently, then that would be great. That'd be perfect, except for the fact that sometimes they don't do that. They withdraw from spending. In other words, whatever earnings they're making, they don't plow back into new spending. This is called the paradox of thrift. This is why savings, excuse me, is considered to be a leakage. And that is, it withdraws money from the income and spending cycle. And what's worse is that during these financial market-induced collapses of the economy, it's even worse because what did people do during the Great Depression? They didn't necessarily put money in banks because the banks were failing and there was no government safety net for deposits, which we do now have. Instead, they would bury money in the backyard or put money in their mattress or whatever. And it was, excuse me, excuse me. I'm just old enough to remember starting my career in banking, where there would occasionally be people who lived through the Great Depression who were, even at that stage, decades later, still wary of banks, and they would pass away and their heirs would come in literally with shopping bags full of cash and say, here, grandmother died, or my mom died, or whatever. And they've got all this cash that they have just been hoarding around their house. Well, that's a double whammy, because not only is it a leakage from the spending cycle, that's money that's gone down a rat hole. It doesn't even get channeled in, but it also can't get channeled back through borrowing. So even this is a slower process. And yes, banks may not want to lend, or anybody else might not want to lend, but at least they have the potential to lend. That's missing when people are taking money and burying in their backyard in a coffee can or whatever. So that's why we need a strong and stable financial system, which is why I know that there was a lot of criticism of the government back in 2008 for bailing out banks. And, you know, the whole idea, you had politicians who really rode this wave pretty strongly, saying, well, Wall Street got a bailout, where's Main Street's bailout? Well, Main Street got a bailout too, really, if you think about it. There were stimulus checks back in those days. There were tax cuts, and President Obama actually did away with the payroll tax on Social Security for a few months. You couldn't let it go forever because that would collapse the system. But Main Street did get something of a bailout. And by the way, Wall Street really didn't get that much bailed out. There were firms that went out of business and went to zero. Shareholders lost every bit of money, employees lost their jobs. And so you really can't say that Wall Street was really that bailed out. It was the system bailing itself out. And this is something that's important to note, and that Keynes talks about this, and that we should be aware of. When we talk about the government, we're not talking about some foreign invaders from some other planet who are dictating things to us. The idea is that if we are in control of our government through the electoral process, and we don't like what the government's doing, we change the people who are governing us, so that they will then, you know, make an effort to do things that we want them to do. And I realize that may sound a little bit idealistic, because it's not that easy for us to just simply vote out a president or members of Congress and whatnot. But that is, in essence, the accountability that does exist. And so when government bails us out, they're just simply bailing everybody out, which is the same with the auto industry. A lot of people, I have colleagues who did not like the idea of the auto industry being bailed out by the government back in 2008, 2009. But they did it because, not that the auto industry was deserving. In fact, GM was probably one of the worst managed big companies ever, I think. It had been for decades, and I am far from alone in that opinion. And I grew up in car country and have heard all kinds of war stories, just the horrendous management decisions that have been made by GM over the years, horrible labor relations that they've had going for a very long time. And that was a company that probably did not deserve to be rescued, but they would have taken down other firms as well. All firms that supply parts, things like batteries and carpeting and aluminum and rubber, all those components that go into a car would have been taken down as well. So when a bailout is coming through some sort of stimulus, it's actually bailing the entire economy out. Okay, so that's what's going on there. So questions about any of this for me? I know I can't hear you, and I didn't really realize this. I just thought people weren't asking questions, and so the only way I could, I just found this out last week, I think, because I've got a night class in which it's much smaller, and people do, it's a little bit of a different setup, but people were trying to ask me things and I couldn't hear them on the microphones. The only way to hear them is if I turn the projector on in this room, turn the projector on, but then I got a big light shining, and it's hard for me to do work on the board, the whiteboard here. I'd have to use PowerPoint slides, and I'm not set up to do that for this class. So I'm going to try to move rooms. So give me a couple of days to do that. I'll try to switch rooms around so that I'm better able to hear you. But if you do have questions, feel free to hit me up in the chat box there. I can see that when you do that, and I can answer your question. Okay, so if you do have questions, feel free to get with me. Meantime, what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to go and erase this, and then I want to sort of get into some of the content that looks a little bit more like what you've seen out of chapter 12. The reason I go through this is because it's a very simple sort of explanation. It's called the expenditures model. It really describes what Keynes is talking about here. It's the idea that the economy is mostly unstable, And so as a result, it needs government support in order for it to survive and thrive. And so if you consider what's going on here, then if we've got this original model with GDP on this axis, and go back to the model we talked about before, where we have GDP on this axis, but we have price on this axis, and all the expenditures here, C plus I plus G plus X minus M, we will include that just because it is there. And we've got different levels of aggregate expenditure. Let me make these vertical axes parallel to each other so we can see it a little better. There we go. So there's a price axis there, and we've got a 45-degree line here. Then we've got different levels of spending, which altogether, basically, C plus I plus G together is aggregate demand, right? So all this together is aggregate demand. So these various levels of spending in the economy basically look something like this. And we'll simply call this aggregate demand 1, aggregate demand 2, aggregate demand 3, all of which correspond then to different levels of GDP. Different levels of GDP. So you've got Y1, oops. Y1, Y2, Y3, and down here, Y1, Y2, Y3. And so what are we really saying here is that whatever these boosts to aggregate demand are coming from, and in Keynes's recommendation, he would love to see businesses fill the void just simply on their own. In the case of an output gap, fill that gap by hiring more workers and putting more workers to work and buying more inventory and all that. But he realizes it's not going to happen because of simple concern and fear. And, the forecast doesn't look good. So the only actor that can voluntarily step in is government. So these successive levels of aggregate demand here really correspond to these particular areas of spending. And since we know that aggregate demand is downward sloping, then we can simply do this. We can simply track the amount of spending in the economy based upon the price level. And this is then how we construct the aggregate demand curve based upon the characteristics that we talked about with regard to aggregate demand back last week. I guess it was last week, we first started talking about aggregate demand and why aggregate demand was downward sloping. And we said it really has to do with the price mechanism and the value of money, essentially. Remember, we said there was the real balances effect. That is, as the price level fell, we would demand more GDP. As the price level rose, we would demand less GDP. Also, foreign purchases effect. If foreign goods are more expensive, we'll buy more of our goods because our goods are less expensive relative to those. If our goods are going up relative to foreign goods, we'll buy more foreign goods and less domestic goods. D is the domestic and gross domestic product, which is what Y represents. Y equals GDP. So, and then the interest rate effect is another example there. So it's a downward sloping sort of situation there. So how then do we link and bring back to the model here aggregate demand and aggregate supply back to the notion of what Keynes is recommending for how to get to full employment? Now, if it sounds like Keynes is all about unemployment and recession, and what to do about it, then that would be a correct interpretation. In fact, one of the criticisms of Keynes, and I certainly heard it when I was both an undergraduate and graduate student, was that Keynes's theories were a little bit too much pegged toward the Great Depression. And they were maybe a little bit outdated because the problems that arose in the 70s, 80s, 90s, et cetera, particularly in the 70s, were not one of unemployment and recession, but really of an economy that was operating at breakneck speed, and we had lots of inflation. So we didn't need government stimulus, a lot of people thought. We needed something which was the counter to stimulus. We needed government to dial it back down a little bit because of all the government expenditure, which really surged ahead beginning in the 1960s. And we're talking about all the spending programs. There were lots and lots of new spending programs on things like housing, education, healthcare, things like Medicare were developed during those years. There was the Vietnam War, all kinds of things. government was spending money on, and it became very inflationary. But that would not be an output gap that's recessionary. That would be an output gap that would be considered inflationary, where the economy is operating at too high rate of speed. Okay. So for us to bring this back then to aggregate demand and aggregate supply, what is Keynes really saying then? So if we take a simple PY model here, and we know that aggregate demand is downward sloping, looking something like that, then what is Keynes' particular theory? He's basically saying, look, if full employment GDP is somewhere out here, right, then how do we account for where the supply side is on this? And what he's saying is the supply side is mostly sticky, and that is aggregate supply actually looks something like this in the short run. Short run aggregate supply is actually horizontal at levels below full employment. At levels below full employment, aggregate supply is actually horizontal. So now you're thinking, well, now I've seen everything. We started with an upward sloping aggregate supply curve. We went to a vertical supply curve. That was the long run aggregate supply curve. Now we've got a horizontal supply curve. What is it? Which is it? Well, it depends upon what we're talking about. In this case, we're talking about Keynes's short run view of the macroeconomy. Now, what he's really talking about is this, that yes, you've got aggregate demand that's out here, okay? But what about aggregate demand not being out there? What about a case in which you've got aggregate demand, which is somewhere here? And so we'll call it AD0, which translates then to some Y sub 0, okay? In other words, you've got aggregate demand, which is insufficient to cover the output gap. Oops, the output gap. In other words, the output gap here is a recessionary gap. A recessionary gap. In other words, it's a case in which actual GDP, which is Y0, is less than full employment GDP or potential GDP, whichever you prefer. So the gap needs to be filled in here somehow. And how it is filled in is by stimulus. By stimulus to aggregate demand, so that we get aggregate demand going to aggregate demand 1, AD2, AD3, etc., so that we can move our way to all the way there. And by the way, at the same time, all these increases are not going to change the price level, which will simply say remain stuck at P bar because prices are what? Sticky. Now you can increase aggregate demand in cases in which GDP is less than full employment GDP and do nothing to raise prices whatsoever. And why? Well, how can you raise prices? How do businesses have the ability to raise prices when they've been through a sluggish phase? Businesses have been strong. They're not really in a position to gain pricing power, and nor are workers able to gain much bargaining power when it comes to wages. So if the wage is simply the price of labor, which is just another price of an output in the economy, just an output of an input, then it becomes stuck too. So as a result, there is no real increase in price level all the way until you get to full employment. And then once you get to full employment, then it takes a turn. It goes like that. And this then becomes the long run aggregate supply picture from right there. And that's sort of a lead off as to what our jumping off point that we'll get to next time when we talk about the classical model. But one thing I want to talk about here with regard to this, one final thing, and I'll sort of go over some of the theoretical ideas from our PowerPoint slide and talk a little bit about those. The other thing that we want to talk about is this, that these successions in aggregate demand really don't have to start. Let's say this gap is say $500 billion. Okay. That is the difference in dollar figure from GDP that would be full employment and GDP, which is actual, which is less than full employment GDP is $500 billion. Well, it works through something called the multiplier effect. And we don't really have a section of the book that gets into the multiplier and talks about it. But the idea of multiplier is this, and it's really sort of the magic of what we're talking about here with regard to stimulating the economy. That is, let's say the government gives everybody $1,000, right? Not a particularly unusual scenario because people got even more than that, right, during these last several rounds of stimulus. But everybody gets $1,000, and they spend most of it, save some of it, spend most of it. And then that spending then results in someone's income somewhere in the economy. They in turn spend it, and then they in turn spend it, and they in turn spend it. And so it's a ripple effect. And some of it gets saved along the way, some of it gets lost and whatever. But for the most part, it has a ripple effect. It compounds. In other words, it's a multiplier. The multiplier effect basically is this. It's the magnification, right? It's the enlargement or the magnification of some initial change in the economy. Some initial change, and there are all kinds of multipliers in the economy. There's spending multipliers on consumption, there are tax multipliers, there are investment multipliers, but it's the magnification of some initial change in the economy. It's the so-called ripple effect, right? The ripple effect. And one thing leads to another, which leads to another, which leads to another. And so the ripple effect is that you get some sort of greater bang for the buck than what you need to get started. And let's say the multiplier is 5, okay? So if the multiplier is 5, that is, if everybody gets $1,000, then it really translates to $5,000 times however many people got that initial stimulus throughout the economy, okay? So if the initial multiplier is 5, then all we need to say is the delta G or delta AD, which could be, remember AD is C plus I plus G, whatever, but we're saying it's probably government, it doesn't matter. If aggregate demand is $100 billion, that's all you need is $100 billion times the multiplier to get to the gap, which is 500 million, and that is the output gap right there. That all you do is you just simply jumpstart the economy to go from here to here, maybe that's 100 billion right there, and then these will simply happen on their own over time as the successive rounds of spending, income spending, take place in the economy. And that is the idea that you don't have to spend $500 billion to close an output gap of 500 billion. You just have to close whatever times the multiplier is going to equal that. So in other words, the multiplier is essentially equal to this. The multiplier is simply this factor by which change in GDP, it's the change in GDP over the initial change in aggregate demand. Or one way of working of it is this, is aggregate demand times the multiplier equals the needed change in aggregate in GDP, which is what we've got, which is what we've done over there. All we're doing is reworking the terms here, multiply both sides by AD, this cancels, and we have AD times the multiplier equals change in GDP. And that's what gives us the movement along the supply curve, which in Keynes's particular point of view, and the neo-Keynesians who followed, was considered to be horizontal in the short run. Meaning what? Meaning that you could stimulate all the way to full employment until these increases became inflationary. And that's the jumping off what we'll get to with regard to the classicist. And so let's talk a little bit about some of these slides here. Some of them I've talked about, some of them I haven't, but I've sort of laid this out for you to sort of follow along and to sort of encapsulate, hopefully, what some of the main points are of this particular set of worldviews. And so let me see, I'm trying to pull up my computer went dormant there. So the two schools of thought are Keynesians, and the Keynesians and today's latter-day manifestation of the neo-Keynesians, and we'll talk a bit more about who they are specifically, hopefully on Thursday. And they're sort of taking themselves, calling themselves the mainstream school, and that is the idea that they're sort of reclaiming some of the lost ground that Keynesians lost during the 70s and 80s, in which when the classicists sort of reared their heads and sort of reasserted some dominance by saying, hey, we're worried about inflation, we're not worried about unemployment, and therefore Keynesianism is sort of a dead letter, it's mostly a depression theory. The Keynesians have sort of come roaring back to life in the last couple decades, and have sort of taken to calling themselves the mainstream view. That is where the original view, sort of the OG economist. And so, first of all, like Keynes in 36, and so later editions were primarily Americans, except for John Hicks, who was a British subject who is probably as responsible for this as anybody else. The actual modeling of this, and then some later models as well, the macroeconomy, which already have a real place in Yeah, macroeconomic lore. Also James Tobin at Yale, Kenneth Arrow at Harvard, and a lot of others. We tend to call these theorists the saltwater school because they tend to be concentrated on both coasts. That is near salty ocean water. And so Harvard, MIT, Columbia, Yale, those kinds of places. It doesn't mean that other parts of the country do not have Keynesians, but we'll contrast those with what are called the freshwater economists. That is, those schools around the Great Lakes, which are freshwater, which tend to have a different worldview, particularly a very skeptical view of this, the idea of stimulus to the economy, particularly when it comes to government involvement. We will get to that more on Thursday. Okay, so what some of the theories are is that economies are inherently unstable. They don't always operate at full employment. This is an important thing that Keynes said in writing the general theory in 1936. The Great Depression was about 7 years underway at that point, and Keynes was saying, look, if economies are stable and if they move themselves back to full employment, then why haven't they done it after all these years? Because he contrasts that with what he calls the classical, the classics are everybody who sort of came before him that he says are wrong, and then afterwards the followers of the original classical school are tend to be lumped in with the neoclassical school. But as to the classicists, he said, look, they believe that if there's unemployment happening in the economy, workers will just take wage cuts and firms will lower prices. And so by firms lowering prices, goods will go back off shelves because people will be able to afford it with their reduced incomes. Workers will take a lower wage. Firms will be able to hire more workers at that lower wage. Unemployment will be cured. As the spending cycle picks back up, because they don't disagree with the idea of the multiplier, they just disagree with the idea of stimulus necessarily. And that once the economy gets going again on its own, it will reach full employment. And Keynes was saying, well, yes, but it's not working. It's because of stickiness. It's getting gummed up. That if we could rely upon C and I only, that would be great, but it's not the case. And look around you, look outside. If you see full employment, then that's great. We have nothing more to talk about, but that is not the case. So something needs to happen, something drastic. So economies are not self-correcting. That in fact, aggregate demand and aggregate supply are unpredictable and unstable. That, as I mentioned a minute ago, C&I themselves can't be counted on. To reach full employment, government intervention is necessary. And so higher government spending is the result of that. And then there are two bits there on monetary and fiscal policy, which for right now is not going to be something we'll talk much about. I'll probably return more to those a bit when we get into those discussions, which are coming up after this third exam. We'll talk about monetary policy, we'll talk about fiscal policy. Those are both the two main forms of what we call stabilization policy. That is, how do we stabilize the economy, both in order to cover a recessionary gap, as well as what to do about moving the other way to cure an inflationary gap. Those are both considered stabilization. And then two instruments are monetary policy conducted by the Federal Reserve and fiscal policy conducted by Congress and the president. And for those of you who are watching any kind of business news, the Federal Reserve is meeting as we speak, I think, actually, and they're probably going to agree to raise interest rates today or tomorrow, probably tomorrow would be my guess. The question is how much and how quickly they intend to do it. So we'll be watching for that statement to see what happens as far as that goes. Okay. So anyway, that sort of does it with my discussion of Keynesianism. Are there questions for me about anything that I've talked about here so far? I know I can't hear you. I've been saying all semester I can hear you, when it probably turns out that I could not hear you. You're probably been wondering why I'm not answering you. And so I apologize. I just didn't realize until the AV guy came out last week and explained what was happening. But in trying to fix it, we have to do something different, which is not going to work. So I'll try to fix that. But if you do put something in the chat box, I can see it. And also I'll be around. During the week, I'm always around, so you can always call me, voicemail me, leave me an email, whatever. And I'm more than glad to get back to you. So when we come back on Thursday, we'll pick up the discussion about economic theory by talking about the classical school and the so-called neoclassicists. We've got actually a number of different ideas about how the economy works. And it's an area that's a particular school of thought that sort of gained some traction after the economic growth of the 60s and 70s. And it's still out there. It still has its advocates. And so we've got these two competing views that are sort of battling it out for dominance, if you like. And so it's something that never ends. But if you expect an economist not to agree on things, well, this is evidence that economists don't agree on things at all times. So, okay. So anyway, have a great day for those of you who are on the live feed. And if not, hope you all enjoy the videos of this. Feel free to get with me and I'll be more than glad to help you with any questions you've got. Okay. See you next time.